At approximately 5:30 p.m. on the 10th of June, 323 BC, in the palace of Nebuchadnezzar II in Babylon, a man lay dying. He was 32 years old. His name was Alexander III of Macedon, known to history as Alexander the Great. Everything had seemed normal only weeks before. He had been planning new conquests, naval expeditions into Arabia, and administrative reforms for his sprawling empire. Then he fell ill after a night of heavy drinking. The fever worsened over the course of several days. His generals gathered around his bed. They asked him who should inherit his empire. Alexander reportedly replied to the strongest. Then he lost the ability to speak. Within hours, he was dead. What happened? The question hangs over the entire story of Alexander's life, but it also applies to the moment of his death. The official cause remains uncertain. Some ancient sources blame malaria, others typhoid fever, still others poison. No autopsy was performed. The physicians who treated him left no clear record. The only certainty is that a man who had conquered the largest empire the world had ever seen died in a bed, not on a battlefield. And with his death, the empire he built began to unravel almost immediately. But to understand how that empire came to exist at all, we need to go back. Back before Alexander was born, back before his father Philip II transformed Macedonia from a peripheral kingdom into a Greek superpower, back to the very foundations of the Persian Achaemenid Empire, which Alexander would eventually destroy. The story of the Macedonian conquest is not simply the story of one man's ambition. It is a story of systematic military innovation, political calculation, strategic exploitation of enemy weaknesses, and a degree of logistical organization that had never been attempted on such a scale. It is also a story of brutality, propaganda, and the limits of human endurance. In the spring of 334 BC, Alexander crossed the Hellespont, the narrow strait separating Europe from Asia, with an army of roughly 32,000 infantry, 5,100 cavalry, and a fleet of about 160 ships. He left behind a regent in Macedonia, Antipater, to hold the Greek states in line. The Persian Empire, under its great king Darius III, controlled a territory that stretched from the Aegean Sea to the Indus River, from Egypt to Central Asia. It had a population estimated at 50 million people. Macedonia, by contrast, had perhaps 4 million. On paper, the invasion was absurd. Yet Alexander had inherited from his father a war machine unlike anything the Mediterranean world had seen. Philip II had spent 2 decades reforming the Macedonian army. He introduced the sarissa, a pike over 18 feet long, which gave the phalanx a reach advantage over Greek hoplites. He drilled his infantry relentlessly, turning farmers and shepherds into a professional force that could maneuver in tight formations. He combined heavy cavalry, the companion cavalry, with light skirmishers and siege engineers. He created a combined arms army that could adapt to any terrain or enemy. And he had already defeated the combined forces of Athens and Thebes at the Battle of Chaeronea in 338 BC, establishing Macedonian hegemony over Greece. When Philip was assassinated in 336 BC, Alexander became king at 20 years old. He immediately faced revolts in the Balkans and in the Greek city-states. He crushed them with speed and ruthlessness. The city of Thebes was razed, its inhabitants sold into slavery. The message was clear: resistance meant annihilation. The Greek states fell into line, and the League of Corinth appointed Alexander as its commander for the invasion of Persia. The campaign had been Philip's plan. Alexander made it his own. The first major test came at the Granicus River in May 334 BC. The Persian satraps of Asia Minor had assembled an army of about 40,000 men, including Greek mercenaries, to block Alexander's advance. The Persians chose their position carefully. The eastern bank of the Granicus, steep and muddy, defended by ranks of cavalry. A frontal assault seemed suicidal. Alexander's senior general, Parmenion, advised caution, suggesting a night crossing or a flanking maneuver. Alexander refused. He believed that hesitation would signal weakness, both to his own men and to the enemy. He led the charge himself. Accounts describe him wearing a distinctive plumed helmet, white feathers, and a bronze breastplate. He plunged into the river, his cavalry following, and fought his way up the opposite bank. The fighting was hand-to-hand, desperate. A Persian nobleman named Spithridates struck Alexander with a sword, shattering his helmet. Another Persian, Rosacus, swung a battle axe that would have killed Alexander if a Macedonian soldier named Cletus had not intervened, cutting Spithridates down. The Macedonians eventually broke the Persian line. The Greek mercenaries in Persian service were surrounded and massacred. Alexander took no prisoners. The western coast of Asia Minor lay open. What happened after Granicus set a pattern? Coastal cities either surrendered or were taken by siege. Greek city-states in Ionia welcomed Alexander as a liberator from Persian rule. He installed democratic governments, at least in name, and collected tribute. He also took over the Persian administrative system, keeping many local officials in place. This was not conquest for its own sake. It was a deliberate strategy to legitimize his rule, presenting himself as the rightful heir to the Persian throne, not a foreign invader. By late 333 BC, Alexander had reached the Gulf of Issus in modern-day Turkey. Darius III had finally assembled the full might of the Persian Empire. He marched with an army estimated at 100,000 to 600,000 men, depending on the source. Modern historians consider the lower number more likely, but even that represented an overwhelming numerical advantage. Darius chose the battlefield carefully, the narrow coastal plain of Issus, where the Persian numbers could not be fully deployed. Alexander forced the battle on November 5, 333 BC. The fighting lasted from dawn until dusk. The Macedonian phalanx pressed forward. The companion cavalry, led by Alexander, aimed directly for Darius. The Persian king panicked and fled, leaving his family, his war chest, and his equipment behind. The army collapsed. It was a catastrophic defeat, but not a fatal one. Darius escaped east to regroup. Alexander could have pursued him immediately. Instead, he turned south, toward the Phoenician coastal cities and Egypt. He needed to neutralize the Persian navy, which still controlled the eastern Mediterranean. The only way to do that was to capture every major port, denying the Persians bases. This led to the most difficult siege of Alexander's career, Tyre. The island city of Tyre, located half a mile off the Phoenician coast, was a fortress with walls rising 150 feet above the sea. Alexander had no navy capable of blockading it, so he built a causeway, a mole, from the mainland to the island, using stones from the ruined mainland city. The Tyrians attacked the workers with fire ships, arrows, catapults. The siege lasted 7 months. Alexander called in ships from the conquered Phoenician cities and built new ones. He constructed siege towers mounted on ships. He breached the walls, then stormed the city. The cost was enormous. Thousands of Tyrians were killed or enslaved. Alexander crucified 2,000 defenders along the coast. It was a message. No city would hold out against him. After Tyre came Gaza, then Egypt. In Egypt, Alexander was welcomed as a liberator from Persian rule. He founded the city of Alexandria, the first of many. He visited the Oracle of Siwa in the Libyan desert, where priests declared him the son of the god Zusammen. This was not merely religious propaganda. It was a political tool. By claiming divine descent, Alexander could demand absolute loyalty, not just as a king, but as a living god. The Greek city-states might have bristled at such claims, but they were too afraid to resist. Meanwhile, Darius made peace overtures. He offered Alexander all the land west of the Euphrates, a huge sum of gold, and his daughter in marriage. Parmenion is said to have remarked that if he were Alexander, he would accept. Alexander replied that if he were Parmenion, he would, but he refused. He wanted nothing less than total conquest. That total conquest came at Gaugamela on October 1st, 331 BC. Darius had assembled another massive army, this time on an open plain near the village of Gaugamela in modern Iraq. He had prepared the ground, clearing obstacles for his chariots. Alexander's army was outnumbered, perhaps 5-1. The battle plan was simple: hold the line with the phalanx, absorb the Persian attacks, then drive a wedge through a gap in the center with the companion cavalry. It worked. Alexander broke through and again went straight for Darius. Again, the Persian king fled. This time, his empire collapsed with him. Alexander marched into Babylon without a fight, then into Susa, the Persian administrative capital. He seized the royal treasury. He then turned toward Persepolis, the ceremonial heart of the empire. There, in a moment of drunken celebration, he is said to have allowed the palace to be burned. Later propagandists would call it revenge for the Persian destruction of Athens in 480 BC. More likely, it was a calculated act: destroy the symbol of Achaemenid legitimacy and there could be no return. But the war was not over. Darius was still alive, gathering a new army in the east. Alexander pursued him across Media and into Parthia. In July 330 BC, a group of Persian officials, led by Bessus, the satrap of Bactria, arrested Darius and stabbed him to death. They left his body in a cart by the roadside. Alexander found it, covered it with his own cloak, and ordered a royal funeral. He then married a Sogdian princess, Roxana, and began recruiting Persian soldiers into his army. He was no longer just a Greek conqueror. He was trying to build a new, mixed empire. What happened next pushed the army to its breaking point. Alexander spent the next 3 years fighting a brutal guerrilla war in Bactria and Sogdiana, modern Afghanistan, Uzbekistan, and Tajikistan. The terrain was mountainous, the winters harsh, the resistance fierce. He founded more cities, called Alexandria, as garrison outposts. He married his generals to Persian noblewomen. He adopted Persian court ceremonial, including the practice of proskenses, or prostrating before the king. The Macedonian soldiers saw this as degrading. Tensions rose. In 327 BC, Alexander executed a close friend, Cleitus, in a drunken rage for insulting him. His historian, Callisthenes, was later executed for plotting against him. The ideal of brotherhood in arms was fracturing. Then came India. In 327 BC, Alexander invaded the Punjab, crossing the Indus River into modern Pakistan. He allied with one local king, Taxiles, and fought another, Porus, at the Battle of the Hydaspes River in 326 BC. Porus fielded a formidable army that included war elephants, animals the Macedonians had never faced. Alexander won the battle through tactics and maneuvering, but it was costly. Porus himself was captured, then reinstated as a client king. Alexander pressed east toward the Ganges River. That is when his army refused. At the Hyphasis River, the men mutinied. They had marched for 8 years, covered over 11,000 miles, fought dozens of battles, endured heat, cold, disease, and the constant threat of death. They had seen Alexander push further than any army had ever gone. They had heard rumors of even larger kingdoms beyond, with hundreds of war elephants. They wanted to go home. Alexander sulked in his tent for 3 days, but the refusal was absolute. He finally agreed to turn back, but the return journey was no less punishing. The army marched through the Jedrosian Desert, a barren wasteland in southern Iran. Thousands died from thirst, heat, and snakes. The fleet that accompanied the army was battered by monsoons. Alexander reached Susa in 324 BC, but the army was a shadow of its former self. He spent the last year of his life trying to hold the empire together. He ordered mass marriages between his Macedonian officers and Persian women. He planned to merge the two cultures. He also faced mutiny from his own veterans, who resented his favoritism toward Persian soldiers. He crushed that mutiny by executing 13 ringleaders. He then dismissed the old soldiers and sent them home with generous gifts. He planned new campaigns, around Arabia, across the Caspian into North Africa. Then he fell ill in Babylon and died. How could this have happened? How could a small kingdom conquer the largest empire in the world in less than a decade? The answer lies in a convergence of factors. First, the Persian Empire was stable on the surface but fragile underneath. The satraps were often disloyal. the central government weak after a series of palace coups. Darius III was not a weak ruler, but he was not a great general. He fled at Issus and Gaugamela, and that shattered morale. Second, Alexander's army was a professional, well-trained, and highly motivated force. The phalanx, the cavalry, the siege engineers, and the logistics network were superior to anything the Persians could field in a single battle. Third, Alexander himself was a leader of extraordinary vision, courage, and ruthlessness. He led from the front, shared the hardships of his men, and inspired a devotion that bordered on worship. But that devotion had limits. The mutiny at the Hiphasis showed that even Alexander could not push his army indefinitely. Fourth, and perhaps most important, Alexander understood that conquest was not enough. He had to build a system of administration that could hold the conquered territories together. He adopted Persian customs, kept local elites in power, and presented himself as the legitimate successor to the Achaemenid kings. This was not tolerance for its own sake, it was pragmatism. Without it, the empire would have collapsed during the Indian campaign, but with it, he bought time. Time ran out in Babylon. After Alexander's death, his generals divided the empire among themselves. The wars of the Diadochi lasted for decades. The empire fragmented into Hellenistic kingdoms, the Ptolemies in Egypt, the Seleucids in Asia, the Antigonids in Macedonia. Alexander's conquests had spread Greek culture and language across the Near East, creating a Hellenistic world that would last until the Roman conquest. But the unity he imposed was artificial and temporary. It existed only because one man held it together. The deeper question, the one that still resonates, is whether Alexander's conquest was inevitable. Could the Persians have stopped him? Could the Greeks have resisted more effectively? Could disease or geography have halted his advance? The historical record suggests that Alexander's invasion succeeded because of a unique combination of military innovation, political opportunity, and individual ambition. It was not inevitable. It was improbable. It was, as the title says, an impossible conquest. And yet it happened. What investigators of history have found, pieced together from ancient sources, archaeological evidence, and modern analysis, is a story of systematic failure on the Persian side, systematic excellence on the Macedonian side, and a central figure who refused to accept limits. The empire Alexander built was fragile, but the conquest itself remains a turning point in world history. It marked the end of the ancient Near Eastern empires and the beginning of a new era, one in which the Mediterranean world, India, and Central Asia were connected in ways they had never been before. That connection came at an enormous cost. Tens of thousands of soldiers and civilians died. Cities were destroyed. Cultures were disrupted. But from that destruction emerged something new. The story of Alexander's impossible conquest is not just about battles and kings. It is about the human capacity to plan, to endure, to destroy, and to create. It is about the thin line between genius and madness, between ambition and hubris. It is about what happens when one person decides that the world as it is not enough, and that he will remake it in his own image. That is what Alexander did. He died before he could finish the job, but the work he started changed the world forever. On the 11th of June, 323 BC, in the palace of Nebuchadnezzar in Babylon, Alexander the Great died. He was 32 years old. The cause remains debated: malaria, typhoid, poisoning, or a combination of exhaustion and alcoholism. No one knows for certain. What is known is that his body lay in state for several days while his generals argued over who would succeed him. There was no clear heir. His half-brother Arhidius was mentally disabled. His unborn child with Roxana would not be born for months. The empire had no successor, only a vacuum. At that moment, the entire structure Alexander had built began to fracture. The generals gathered in Babylon and agreed to a partition. Perdiccas, the senior cavalry commander, became regent for the unborn heir. The satrapies were divided among the leading generals. Ptolemy took Egypt, Antipater kept Macedonia and Greece, Seleucus received Babylon, Lysimachus took Thrace, and Antigonus Monophthalmus, the one-eyed general, controlled Phrygia and parts of Asia Minor. This was not a settlement. It was a temporary truce between ambitious men who each wanted the whole prize. What happened next was a series of wars that lasted for 40 years. The Wars of the Diadochi, or successors, began almost immediately. In 321 BC, Perdiccas invaded Egypt to crush Ptolemy but was assassinated by his own officers. In 319 BC, Antipater died, leaving his son Cassander in charge. Cassander later murdered Alexander's mother Olympias, his wife Roxana, and his son Alexander IV. The boy was only 12 years old. By 309 BC, every direct heir of Alexander was dead. The empire was now a collection of independent kingdoms ruled by men who had once served under him. The wars themselves were brutal, fought with the same phalanxes and cavalry Alexander had used. But without his leadership, these armies turned on each other. The battles were enormous. Ipsus in 301 BC involved over 100,000 men. The casualties were staggering. Entire cities were destroyed. The Greek world bled itself dry for decades. The question arises, could Alexander have prevented this? He had tried to create a unified ruling class by marrying his generals to Persian women. He had attempted to fuse Greek and Persian cultures, but these measures were superficial. The empire was held together only by his personal authority and the fear he inspired. When that authority vanished, the center could not hold. The consequences of this collapse were far-reaching. The Hellenistic world that emerged was not one empire but three major kingdoms: Ptolemaic Egypt, Seleucid Asia, and Antigonid Macedonia. Each was a hybrid of Greek and local traditions. Greek became the language of administration and trade across the eastern Mediterranean. Greek art, philosophy, and science spread to Central Asia and northern India, but the price of this spread was instability. The successor kingdoms constantly fought each other, which drained their resources and eventually made them vulnerable to a rising power to the west, Rome. By the 2nd century BC, the Hellenistic kingdoms were in decline. Rome defeated Macedonia in 3 wars, the last ending with the Battle of Pydna in 168 BC. The Seleucid Empire was weakened by civil wars and crushed by the rising Parthian Empire. Ptolemaic Egypt survived longer but finally fell to Rome in 30 BC after the death of Cleopatra, the last Hellenistic queen. The dream of a unified Greek-speaking world that Alexander had sought to create was replaced by Roman hegemony. In a sense, the impossible conquest had achieved something intangible. It had connected East and West, but that connection was paved with war and suffering. How could such a brief empire have such a lasting impact? The answer lies in the cultural and institutional changes Alexander forced. He founded over 20 cities named Alexandria, from Egypt to Afghanistan. These cities became centers of Greek learning, trade, and administration. The most famous, Alexandria in Egypt, housed the Library of Alexandria and the Museum, which attracted scholars from across the Mediterranean. Euclid, Archimedes, Eratosthenes, and many others worked there. Greek science, medicine, and philosophy flourished in a way they might not have in a purely Greek environment. The Hellenistic period saw advances in astronomy, geometry, geography, and engineering that would not be equaled for centuries. But the cultural fusion was often shallow. Alexander's policy of mass marriages between his officers and Persian women was resented by both sides. The children of these unions were often marginalized. The Macedonian soldiers saw Persian customs as decadent. The Persians saw the Macedonians as barbarians. The empire was held together by force and patronage, not by any deep loyalty. This is why it collapsed so quickly. Alexander's own behavior in his final years, his paranoia, his drinking, his executions of friends and rivals, suggests that the man who conquered the world could not conquer himself. He was a victim of his own success. Historians have long debated whether Alexander intended to create a lasting empire or was simply driven by a restless desire for personal glory. The evidence points to both. He planned new campaigns, circumnavigation of Arabia, conquest of Carthage and North Africa, perhaps even an invasion of Italy. He was mapping out routes and ordering shipbuilding when he fell ill. But these plans died with him. His empire became a cautionary tale about the limits of ambition. What can we learn from the impossible conquest? First, that military genius alone cannot hold an empire together. Second, that systems of governance, succession, and cultural integration need to be built slowly over generations, not imposed by force. Third, that individual leadership, no matter how brilliant, is fragile. Alexander was irreplaceable, and his empire was too. The Persian Empire, for all its flaws, had survived for over 2 centuries because it had developed administrative structures that could function without a charismatic ruler. Alexander's empire had no such structures. It was a one-man show, and when the star died, the show was over. The archaeological record confirms this. Excavations of Hellenistic cities show layers of destruction and rebuilding. At Ai Khanum in modern Afghanistan, a Greek city flourished for over a century before being destroyed by nomads. The Greek influence left behind temples, gymnasiums, and Greek inscriptions, but the city was not truly integrated into a larger political system. When the central authority weakened, the local population reverted to older ways. The same pattern occurred across the Near East. Greek culture was a veneer that gradually faded as the successor kingdoms collapsed, yet the legacy endured in unexpected ways. The Silk Road, which would later connect China to the Roman world, was made possible in part by Alexander's conquests, which opened up routes through Central Asia. Buddhism was influenced by Greek art, leading to the development of Greco-Buddhist statues in Gandhara. The spread of Greek coinage standardized trade across vast regions. Even after the Romans conquered the Hellenistic kingdoms, they adopted many Greek institutions, including the idea of a universal empire ruled by a single emperor. Hadrian's Wall, the Roman roads, the imperial cult, all have echoes of Alexander's ambition. The human cost of Alexander's conquest is harder to measure precisely. Modern estimates suggest that his campaigns caused the deaths of hundreds of thousands of soldiers and civilians. The destruction of Thebes, the massacre at Tyre, the slaughter at Persepolis, the casualties at the Battle of Hydaspes, and the march through the Gedrosian Desert, these were not minor events. They were catastrophic. Entire communities were erased. The survivors were often enslaved or resettled. The suffering was immense. And yet, the image of Alexander that has survived is largely heroic. He is the young king who wept because there were no more worlds to conquer. He is the general who never lost a battle. He is the visionary who dreamed of a united humanity. These images are partly true but also partly myth. The real Alexander was a ruthless conqueror, a paranoid ruler, a man who killed his friends in drunken rages and who was deeply insecure about his own legitimacy. He was Greek but also Macedonian, and the Greeks themselves considered him a barbarian. He was the son of a god but died of a fever. The impossible conquest remains a subject of fascination because it raises questions that are still relevant. How much power should one person have? When does ambition become madness? Can a conqueror ever truly integrate the peoples he subjugates? These questions have no easy answers. The story of Alexander is a story of the human will, its capacity for greatness and destruction. In the end, the Macedonian Empire lasted only 10 years after Alexander's death. But the echo of that brief moment has reverberated for more than 2,000 years. The cities he founded became centers of learning that shaped Western science. The art and culture he spread influenced Buddhism and Islamic philosophy. The idea of a single world empire inspired everyone from Julius Caesar to Napoleon. Alexander's conquest was impossible, improbable, and unsustainable, but it happened, and the world has never been the same. On a spring morning in 331 BC, Alexander's army crossed the Tigris River near the ruins of the ancient Assyrian capital of Nineveh. The date is estimated to be around the 20th of September, though the exact day is lost to the inconsistencies of ancient calendars. Alexander had with him roughly 47,000 men. The Persian king Darius III had been assembling a massive force for over a year. Estimates vary, but modern historians place the Persian army at somewhere between 100,000 and 250,000 soldiers, including cavalry, infantry, chariots, and elephants. Darius had chosen the plain of Gaugamela, about 70 kilometers east of modern Mosul in Iraq, as his battlefield. The ground was flat, open, and deliberately cleared of obstacles to allow his scythed chariots to charge unimpeded. Everything was prepared for a decisive confrontation. In the days before the battle, Alexander's scouts reported the Persian disposition. The Macedonian camp was uneasy. Many of his officers had never faced such a numerical disparity. Parmenion, Alexander's second-in-command and a veteran of Philip's campaigns, advised a night attack. Alexander refused, reportedly saying he would not steal a victory. But there may have been another reason. A night attack against a force that large could easily descend into chaos. The Macedonians needed daylight to coordinate their complex maneuvers. On the morning of the battle, Alexander drew up his army in a formation that would become legendary. He placed the phalanx in the center, slightly echeloned back on both flanks. On his left, Parmenion commanded the Thessalian and allied cavalry. On his right, Alexander himself led the elite companion cavalry. Behind the main line, he stationed a reserve force of Greek mercenaries and light infantry, ordered to face about and fight any Persian force that attempted to encircle them. This was a tactical innovation, the first recorded use of a dedicated battlefield reserve. Darius positioned his own army in a long line. He placed his best cavalry on both flanks, intending to envelop the smaller Macedonian force. In the center, he positioned the Persian immortals and the Greek mercenaries he had hired. In front of the line, he stationed the scythed chariots and 15 war elephants. The plan was simple. The chariots would break the Macedonian phalanx, the cavalry would encircle, and the infantry would mop up. What happened next was a masterclass in timing and deception. Alexander began advancing his entire line, but he did so at an oblique angle, marching his right wing forward while keeping his left wing refused. This forced the Persian left flank cavalry to charge earlier than planned to prevent being outflanked. As the Persian cavalry committed, a gap opened in the Persian line near the center. Alexander saw the gap. He immediately led the companion cavalry in a wedge formation straight into that gap, driving toward Darius himself. The Persian king, seeing the Macedonian cavalry bearing down on him, panicked. He turned his chariot and fled the battlefield. This was the critical moment. The Persian army, despite its numerical superiority, had no independent command structure. When the king fled, the cohesion dissolved. Units fought on independently but without coordinated leadership. Meanwhile, Parmenion on the left was heavily pressed by Persian cavalry, but the reserve line held and prevented a breakthrough. The battle lasted only a few hours. The Persian army was not destroyed, many soldiers escaped, but it was decisively defeated as a fighting force. Darius fled east into the mountains of Media. Alexander pursued but could not catch him. The Battle of Gaugamela effectively ended the Achaemenid Empire as a political entity. Alexander was now the undisputed master of the Persian heartland. How could a force of fewer than 50,000 men defeat an army that outnumbered it by at least 2 to 1, perhaps 5 to 1? The answer lies in combined arms tactics, discipline, and leadership. The Macedonian phalanx, with its long sarissas, could hold off any frontal assault. The companion cavalry were heavily armored shock troops that could exploit any break in the enemy line. And Alexander himself was on the battlefield, leading from the front, making decisions in real time. Darius, by contrast, was a commander who watched from a distance and fled when the fighting came close. But the victory at Gaugamela also revealed a weakness that would plague Alexander for the rest of his campaign. He could not control the territory he conquered. After the battle, he marched to Babylon, which surrendered without a fight. He entered the city as a liberator. He left a garrison and a satrap and moved on, then to Susa, then to Persepolis. Each city fell quickly, but each required a garrison, officials, and a system of taxation. Alexander had no trained administrators. He relied on Persian nobles who had been loyal to Darius, which created resentment among his Macedonian officers. The seeds of the later fragmentation were planted in the first year after Gaugamela. At Persepolis, in the spring of 330 BC, Alexander allowed his army to sack the city. Accounts differ on whether this was a calculated act of revenge for the Persian invasion of Greece in 480 BC or simply a drunken decision. The palace of Xerxes was set on fire. The library of Persepolis was destroyed. Alexander later expressed regret, but the damage was done. The Persian elite saw him not as a legitimate successor, but as a destroyer. From that point, resistance shifted from open battle to guerrilla warfare in the eastern satrapies. 1 month after Persepolis, Alexander learned that Darius had been captured by his own satrap Bessus. He immediately set out with a small cavalry force to intercept. He rode through the night, covering more than 400 kilometers in 11 days. When he finally caught up, he found Darius dead, stabbed by his own officers. Alexander ordered the body embalmed and sent to Persepolis for a royal burial. Then he turned east. The man who had been the king of kings was gone. The man who would replace him still had 6 years of campaigning ahead. What followed was the most grueling part of the entire conquest, the campaign in Central Asia. Alexander pursued Bessus, who had declared himself king as Artaxerxes V. He marched through the Hindu Kush mountains in winter, losing many men to frostbite and altitude sickness. He founded a city called Alexandria in the Caucasus, modern Bagram in Afghanistan. He fought the Sogdian and Bactrian tribes who used hit-and-run tactics. At the siege of the Sogdian Rock, a fortress thought impregnable, Alexander selected 300 volunteers to climb a sheer cliff face at night. They used tent pegs and ropes to ascend. When the defenders awoke, they saw Macedonians above them and surrendered. The story, like many of Alexander's exploits, may be exaggerated, but it became part of the legend. In 327 BC, Alexander married Roxana, a Bactrian princess. This was part of his policy of fusion, but it angered his Macedonian officers. They saw it as a betrayal of Macedonian blood. The tension simmered. In the same year, Alexander introduced the custom of proskenses, the Persian practice of prostrating oneself before the king. The Macedonians refused. One of Alexander's historians, Callisthenes, openly opposed the policy. Alexander later had him executed on charges of conspiracy. The relationship between the conqueror and his army was fracturing. By 326 BC, Alexander crossed the Indus River into India. He fought King Porus at the Battle of the Hydaspes River near modern Jhelum in Pakistan. Porus fielded 200 war elephants and thousands of infantry. Alexander used a feint crossing upstream, then attacked the Indian flank while Porus was still aligning his forces. The battle was brutal. The Macedonian cavalry had to avoid the elephants, which could trample horses and men. Porus fought from the back of an elephant until he was wounded and captured. When Alexander asked how he wished to be treated, Porus replied, "Like a king." Alexander was impressed and restored him as a satrap of his own territory. This was a rare moment of magnanimity, but the army had reached its limit. After the Hydaspes, they marched east toward the Ganges River. Local informants told them of even larger kingdoms, the Nanda Empire with thousands of elephants. The men refused to go further. They had been on campaign for 8 years. They were exhausted, homesick, and demoralized. Alexander stayed in his tent for 3 days, refusing to speak to anyone. Then he relented. He ordered the construction of a fleet to sail down the Indus River. The march back through the Gedrosian desert would be a catastrophe. Thousands died of thirst, heat, and snake bites. Alexander himself had to be carried on a stretcher. By the time the survivors reached Babylon in 323 BC, the army was a shadow of its former self. Investigators, if one can call them that, have long wondered why Alexander drove his men so hard. The answer may lie in his psychology. He was competing with the memory of his father Philip, who had unified Greece and planned to invade Persia. Alexander had to exceed Philip's achievements. He was also competing with the mythical heroes Achilles and Heracles, whom he claimed as ancestors. The impossible conquest was not just a military campaign, it was a personal quest for immortality. But the human cost was staggering. Ancient sources claim that of the 40,000 men who marched into India, only about 10,000 returned to Babylon. Modern historians adjust those numbers, but the scale of loss remains enormous. The systems that failed Alexander were not tactical but logistical and political. He never established a reliable succession mechanism. He never trained a corps of native administrators who were loyal to him rather than to local warlords. He relied on fear and charisma, which evaporated when he fell ill. The empire he built was a house of cards. When he died in Babylon on the 10th of June, 323 BC, his generals immediately began carving up the provinces. The empire that had been assembled in 10 years unraveled in 10 months. Yet the cultural impact of that brief unification was profound. The Hellenistic period that followed saw the spread of Greek language, art, and science across 3 continents. The city of Alexandria in Egypt became the intellectual capital of the Mediterranean. Greek became the lingua franca of the Eastern Roman Empire. The New Testament was written in Greek. The Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, was produced in Alexandria. The very idea of a universal empire, ruled by a single autocrat, would be inherited by the Romans and later by the Byzantines. What can we learn from the impossible conquest? Perhaps the lesson is that human ambition, when unchecked by institutions, will self-destruct. Alexander conquered the known world but could not conquer himself. He died at 32, probably of a fever exacerbated by alcohol, exhaustion, and old wounds. His empire followed him into the grave. The dream of a unified world endured as a myth, but the reality was a world of warring kingdoms, each claiming the mantle of Alexander. The question of whether the conquest was worth the suffering remains unanswered. The ruins of Persepolis, the lost cities of Bactria, the scattered bones of soldiers in the Gedrosian desert, all are silent witnesses to a brief moment when one man tried to remake the world in his image. He failed, but the energy of that failure sparked 2,000 years of history. In the summer of 323 BC, Alexander's body lay in state in Babylon for several days while his generals debated the succession. There was no clear heir. His half-brother Orhidius was mentally disabled and unable to rule. Roxana was pregnant, but the child had not yet been born. The army proclaimed Orhidius as Philip III, with Perdiccas appointed as regent. A few months later, Roxana gave birth to a son, Alexander IV. The 2 kings were figureheads. The real power rested with the generals who had commanded the army during the campaign. The first crisis came within a year. Perdiccas attempted to hold the empire together by force. He ordered the execution of several potential rivals. He married Alexander's sister Cleopatra to strengthen his claim, but the other generals saw him as a threat. Ptolemy, who had been appointed satrap of Egypt, rebelled first. In 321 BC, Perdiccas marched against Ptolemy but was assassinated by his own officers after a failed crossing of the Nile. His body was left in the desert. The empire fractured instantly. What followed was a 40-year period of warfare known as the Wars of the Diadochi, the successors. Each general controlled a portion of the empire. Ptolemy held Egypt and Cyrenaica. Seleucus held Babylonia and later Syria. Antigonus Monophthalmus controlled Asia Minor and much of the eastern satrapies. Lysimachus ruled Thrace. Cassander, son of Antipater, controlled Macedonia and Greece. The map changed every few years as alliances shifted and battles were fought. One of the most decisive battles occurred at Ipsus in 301 BC. Antigonus, the most powerful of the successors, had declared himself king and threatened to reunite the empire under his rule. The other kings, Seleucus, Lysimachus, Cassander, and Ptolemy, formed a coalition. At Ipsus, in central Anatolia, the coalition army of approximately 64,000 infantry and 10,000 cavalry faced Antigonus's 70,000 infantry and 10,000 cavalry. The battle turned when Seleucus's war elephants, trained to avoid enemy phalanx formations, broke through the flank of Antigonus's army. Antigonus was killed by a javelin. His son Demetrius fled. The dream of a restored empire died with Antigonus. After Ipsus, the Hellenistic world settled into three major kingdoms: Ptolemaic Egypt, Seleucid Syria and Mesopotamia, and Antigonid Macedonia. Smaller states like Pergamon, Rhodes, and the Greco-Bactrian kingdom also emerged. These kingdoms would dominate the eastern Mediterranean for the next 2 centuries. Each claimed to be the legitimate successor of Alexander. Each adopted elements of Persian administration, Greek military tactics, and local customs. The fusion that Alexander had envisioned was partially realized, but only in fragmented form. In Egypt, Ptolemy Isoter founded the Ptolemaic dynasty. He commissioned the construction of the Library of Alexandria, which would become the largest collection of scrolls in the ancient world. He invited scholars from Greece, Egypt, and Mesopotamia to translate and preserve knowledge. Euclid wrote his Elements in Alexandria. Eratosthenes calculated the circumference of the earth using a well in Sine and a stick in Alexandria. The city became the intellectual capital of the Mediterranean. Greek became the language of administration and scholarship. The Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, was produced there around 250 BC. The cultural influence of Hellenism was not a gentle diffusion, it was a deliberate policy of the ruling elite. In the Seleucid Empire, the challenge was different. The territory stretched from the Mediterranean to the Indus River. It contained dozens of ethnic groups, religions, and languages. The Seleucid kings founded new cities: Antioch, Seleucia on the Tigris, Apamea, and settled Greek and Macedonian veterans there. These cities served as outposts of Hellenic culture and administration, but the empire was chronically unstable. Local dynasts like the Maccabees in Judea revolted against Hellenistic influence. The Parthians, a nomadic people from the Caspian Sea region, began to encroach on the eastern satrapies. By 140 BC, the Seleucids had lost control of Mesopotamia and Iran. The empire shrank to a small kingdom around Antioch. In Macedonia, the Antigonid dynasty continued to rule Greece through alliances and garrisons. They attempted to revive the League of Corinth and project power into the Aegean, but the Greek city-states resented Macedonian domination. The Achaean League and the Aetolian League resisted. Rome was watching. In 197 BC, at the Battle of Cynoscephaly, the Roman legions defeated the Macedonian phalanx for the first time. The phalanx, which had conquered Persia under Alexander, proved rigid against the flexible Roman maniple system. The writing was on the wall. The final blow came in 168 BC at Pydna in northern Greece. The Macedonian king Perseus commanded a phalanx of about 20,000 men. The Roman consul Lucius Aemilius Paulus led about 25,000 legionaries. The battle began with the phalanx advancing downhill, pushing the Romans back, but the uneven terrain caused gaps in the Macedonian line. Roman cohorts exploited these gaps, attacking the phalangites from the sides and rear. The phalanx disintegrated. Perseus surrendered. Macedonia was divided into 4 republics, then later annexed as a Roman province. The last great successor kingdom fell. What remained of Alexander's empire was cultural, not political. Greek art, architecture, philosophy, and science spread as far as Afghanistan and India. The Greco-Bactrian kingdom, founded by Diodotus in 250 BC, produced Hellenistic coins and Buddhist statues that combined Greek and Indian styles. The Indo-Greek king Menander I converted to Buddhism. The friezes of Gandhara show Apollo and Buddha side by side. The Silk Road would later carry Greek astronomical knowledge to China. The Septuagint made Jewish scriptures accessible to the Roman world. The New Testament was written in Greek. The Apostle Paul, a Greek-speaking Roman citizen, traveled the roads built by Hellenistic kings, but the political failure was absolute. Alexander had created an empire that relied entirely on his personal authority. He had no succession plan, no stable bureaucracy, no system for integrating conquered peoples beyond superficial gestures like mass weddings at Susa in 324 BC. At that event, Alexander forced his officers to marry Persian noblewomen. Most of those marriages were annulled immediately after his death. The policy of fusion was a failure. The resentment it caused among Macedonians contributed to the fragmentation. How could this have happened? The answer lies in the nature of Alexander's leadership. He was a military genius, but he was not a statesman. He could capture cities, but he could not govern them. He could inspire loyalty among his soldiers, but he could not control their ambition. His empire was built on speed and violence, not on institutions. When he died, there was no constitution, no parliament, no civil service. There was only the army, and the army chose its own leaders. Investigators of historical causality point to the briefing that never happened. Alexander never trained a successor. He never wrote down a plan for governance. He never delegated real authority to a trusted lieutenant. His closest friend, Hephaestion, had died of fever in 324 BC, and Alexander's grief may have clouded his judgment. Ancient sources report that he ordered the execution of Hephaestion's doctor and built a massive funeral pyre costing 10,000 talents. He was already descending into paranoia. He executed or imprisoned several officers on suspicion of conspiracy. By the time he fell ill in Babylon, he trusted almost no one. On the 10th of June, 323 BC, Alexander died after a 10-day fever. The official cause was probably typhoid fever or malaria, complicated by heavy drinking and an old wound in his chest. Some ancient sources hint at poisoning, but modern historians consider that unlikely. What is certain is that his final words, according to one account, were, "To the strongest," but different versions exist. Some say he said, "I foresee a great funeral contest over me." Either way, he left no clear instruction. The strongest did not emerge. Instead, a generation of generals fought over the corpse. The body itself became a political tool. Ptolemy hijacked the funeral cortege and brought it to Memphis, then later to Alexandria, where it was housed in a golden sarcophagus. Alexander's corpse became a tourist attraction and a symbol of legitimacy for the Ptolemies. It remained there for centuries until it disappeared from history, probably destroyed in a riot or relocated by the Romans. Today, the legacy of the impossible conquest is ambiguous. On one hand, Alexander accelerated the spread of Greek culture across the ancient world, enabling exchanges that shaped philosophy, science, and religion for centuries. On the other hand, he destroyed the Persian Empire, which had been a relatively stable and tolerant system. He caused the deaths of tens of thousands of soldiers and civilians. He left a power vacuum that led to continuous warfare for 2 generations. The Hellenistic period was not an age of peace. It was an age of war, piracy, and economic exploitation. The question of whether the conquest was worth the suffering remains unanswered. It cannot be answered in terms of net benefit. It can only be measured by the stories that survive. The soldiers who died in the Gedrosian desert, the women of Persepolis who were enslaved, the assassins who killed Bessus and the defenders who jumped from the Sogdian rock, and the one man who saw the limits of the known world and decided they were not enough. In the end, Alexander's impossible conquest teaches a lesson about human ambition that is still relevant today. Single individuals can reshape history, but they cannot control the aftermath. The energy of that failure, the collapse of an empire into competing kingdoms, created the landscape in which the Roman Republic grew. Rome learned from Alexander's mistakes. They built institutions. They integrated conquered peoples through citizenship. They created a system that lasted for centuries, not just a decade. But they also studied Alexander's tactics, his logistics, and his psychology. Julius Caesar wept at Alexander's tomb in Alexandria, not because he had died, but because he had achieved so little compared to what he could have done. The energy of the conquest sparked 2,000 years of history. It ignited the Hellenistic world, which lit the Roman world, which sparked the Byzantine, Islamic, and European worlds. Greek science and philosophy survived the Dark Ages because they were preserved in Arabic translations, which were later retranslated into Latin. That chain of transmission began with the libraries founded by Alexander's successors, and yet the ruins remain. Persepolis is a tourist site. The Library of Alexandria is gone. The Alexanders of the world rise and fall. The dust settles, the stories endure, and in the silence of a sleepless night, we can still hear the echo of that impossible march, a young king, an army, and a dream that could not die. In the years following Alexander's death, the empire began to fracture not slowly, but violently. The first sign came in Babylon on the very same day he died. The generals gathered in the palace to decide who would rule. No one trusted anyone else. Perdiccas, the senior cavalry commander, proposed that Alexander's unborn child by Roxana would be king, with a regent ruling in his place. The infantry, however, preferred Alexander's half-wit half-brother, Philip or Hideus. The two factions nearly came to blows. A compromise was struck. Both would rule as joint kings, with Perdiccas as regent. But the agreement was a facade. Within hours, the generals began partitioning the satrapies among themselves. Ptolemy took Egypt, Antigonus took Phrygia, Lysimachus took Thrace, Seleucus took Babylon. The empire was divided before the funeral was even arranged. What happened next was a series of wars that lasted 40 years. No single general could claim the whole. Each believed he was the rightful successor. The question was not who had the best claim, but who could raise the largest army and hold the most territory. The initial war began in 322 BC when Perdiccas tried to impose his authority over Ptolemy. He marched into Egypt with a massive army, but the Nile proved impassable. His troops mutinied. Perdiccas was assassinated in his tent by his own officers. His body was left in the sand. The lesson was clear. Ambition without results meant death. The vacuum drew in Antigonus, known as Monophthalmus, the One-Eyed. He had been a general under Alexander and was now the most powerful of the Diadochi. By 317 BC, he controlled Asia Minor, Syria, and Mesopotamia. He declared himself supreme commander and demanded that all other satraps submit. They refused. A coalition formed against him: Ptolemy, Seleucus, Lysimachus, and Cassander, the son of Antipater. The war expanded across 3 continents. Armies marched from the Aegean to the Indus. Cities were sacked. Populations were enslaved. In 316 BC, Antigonus captured Seleucus's capital of Babylon. Seleucus fled to Egypt. Antigonus then turned his attention to the eastern satrapies. He fought the Persian rebel Pusestas, then the Bactrian governor Stasaner. He imposed his own governors and collected tribute. But he made a fatal mistake. He executed an innocent governor named Eumenes, who had been a loyal ally of the royal family. The execution alienated many officers. It also gave Ptolemy a propaganda weapon. He framed Antigonus as a tyrant who had betrayed Alexander's legacy. The decisive battle came in 301 BC at Ipsus, in central Anatolia. Antigonus commanded about 70,000 infantry and 10,000 cavalry. The coalition under Seleucus and Lysimachus fielded comparable numbers. The battle began with a cavalry charge led by Antigonus's son Demetrius, who drove back the enemy left wing. But Demetrius pursued too far, leaving his father's flank exposed. Seleucus's war elephants, a gift from the Indian king Chandragupta, blocked Demetrius's return. The phalanx of Antigonus was encircled and destroyed. Antigonus, aged 81, died fighting. He had refused to retreat. His body was never recovered. After Ipsus, the map of the Hellenistic world crystallized into 3 major kingdoms: Ptolemaic Egypt, Seleucid Asia, and Antigonid Macedonia. Each claimed to be the true heir of Alexander. Each maintained a court culture modeled on his. Each minted coins bearing his portrait. But none could reunite the empire. They fought border wars for another century. The Seleucids lost the eastern satrapies to the Parthians. The Ptolemies lost Cyprus and the Aegean islands to Rome. The Antigonids lost Greece itself. How could this have happened? The answer lies not just in Alexander's death, but in the structure he left behind. The empire had no civil service, no tax system, no legal code that applied beyond the army. Satraps were military commanders who collected tribute by force. The only unifying factor was Alexander's personal authority. When that vanished, there was nothing to hold the pieces together. The generals who took over had no loyalty to any state. They had loyalty to their own armies. And armies, as Alexander himself knew, are only as stable as the coin that pays them. The human cost of these wars was staggering. In 315 BC, Antigonus besieged Tyre for 15 months. The city was rebuilt after Alexander's destruction, but Antigonus razed it again. The survivors were sold into slavery. In 310 BC, the regent Cassander ordered the murder of Alexander's mother, Olympias, and his son, Alexander IV, along with his widow Roxana. The boy was 13. Cassander buried the bodies in secret. The line of Alexander was extinguished. In 308 BC, Ptolemy ordered the assassination of his own rival, Cleomenes, to secure Egypt. In 305 BC, Demetrius besieged Rhodes for a year. The Rhodians held out, but the city was devastated. They built the Colossus of Rhodes to celebrate their survival. The statue, 100 feet tall, stood at the harbor for only 56 years before an earthquake toppled it. The wars did not stop. In 280 BC, a new generation of kings rose. Antiochus I, son of Seleucus, fought the Gauls who had invaded Anatolia. He defeated them using war elephants. But the Gauls settled in Galatia, a region that remained a source of instability for centuries. In 276 BC, Antigonus Gonatas, grandson of Antigonus the One-Eyed, secured the throne of Macedonia. He rebuilt the fleet and fought the Ptolemies for control of the Aegean. But Macedonia itself was worn out. The population had declined. The treasury was empty. The phalanx that had conquered the world was now a shadow of its former self. The endgame came when Rome intervened. In 200 BC, Rome declared war on the Macedonian king Philip V. The pretext was a dispute over Greek cities. The real reason was that Rome had become the dominant power in the Mediterranean and could not tolerate a rival. Philip V was defeated at Cynocephaly in 197 BC. His son Perseus was defeated at Pydna in 168 BC. The Antigonid kingdom was dismembered. The Seleucid kingdom collapsed under the weight of civil wars and Parthian invasions. In 64 BC, the Roman general Pompey annexed the remnants. Egypt fell in 30 BC after Cleopatra's suicide. What remained after the collapse was not an empire, but an idea. Alexander's conquests had created a network of Greek-speaking cities from the Adriatic to the Indus. These cities shared a common culture, a common language, and a common literature. The Library of Alexandria collected hundreds of thousands of scrolls. The museum conducted research in astronomy, geography, medicine. Eratosthenes calculated the circumference of the Earth. Euclid wrote the elements. Archimedes invented the screw and the lever. The technology of war also advanced: torsion catapults, siege towers, naval artillery. But the culture of the Hellenistic world was not built on peace. It was built on the spoils of endless war. The lesson of the impossible conquest is that human ambition, however brilliant, cannot transcend human mortality. Alexander's dream of a unified world ended with his fever. The generals who tried to claim his mantle ended up destroying what he built. The cities he founded became capitals of rival empires. The armies he trained fought each other. The roads he built carried conquerors, not diplomats. And the soldiers who followed him across the desert and through the passes died for a cause that dissolved within a generation. In the silence that follows the history, what remains is the story itself. The story of a young king who crossed the Hellespont with 40,000 men and never looked back. The story of a siege at Tyre that changed military engineering forever. the story of a battle at Gaugamela that decided the fate of a continent. The story of a man who wept because there were no more worlds to conquer, then died of a fever in a palace he had built for himself. The impossible conquest was possible for a moment. It lasted long enough to change the world, but it was never enough to change human nature. In the autumn of 310 BC, inside the fortress of Amphipolis in northern Greece, a boy of 13 was taken from his cell. His name was Alexander IV, son of Alexander the Great and the Bactrian princess Roxana. He had been held captive since infancy along with his mother under the guard of the regent Cassander. On that day, Cassander gave the order. The boy was executed by poison. His body was buried in the sand of the prison courtyard, unmarked. No monument was raised. No official announcement was made. The direct male line of the conqueror ended not in battle but in silence. What happened? The murder of Alexander IV was not an act of vengeance. It was political calculation. Cassander had seized control of Macedon after the death of Antipater. He had already eliminated Alexander's mother, Olympias, by stoning in 316 BC. He had forced Roxana and the boy into confinement. As long as Alexander IV lived, he was a legitimate rival. Any general who wanted to challenge Cassander could claim to fight for the rightful king. By removing the boy, Cassander removed that threat, but he also removed the last symbol of unity. The empire had no regent, no successor, no royal family. The Diadochi no longer even pretended to preserve Alexander's heritage. They became kings in their own right. Investigators, historians who later pieced together the evidence, found the details in fragmentary chronicles. Diodorus Siculus recorded the event. The Parian marble dates it, but the silence was deliberate. The assassination was kept secret for years. When it became known, there was no outrage. The Greek world had grown accustomed to the murder of royal children. By this point, the wars of the successors had already consumed hundreds of thousands of lives. The death of one more boy barely registered. How could this have happened? The answer lies in the nature of power after Alexander. The conqueror had never established a clear succession plan. He had appointed no regent, no council, no body of advisors that could hold the empire together after his death. He had left his generals with no loyalty to any institution. Their loyalty was to personal ambition and to the armies they commanded. Armies, as Alexander himself knew, were only as stable as the coin that paid them. When the treasury emptied, the armies turned on their commanders. The empire became a machine for extracting wealth, and the machine eventually consumed itself. The human cost of this collapse was staggering. Between the death of Alexander in 323 BC and the Battle of Ipsus in 301 BC, the Greek world lost an estimated 500,000 soldiers. The civilian toll was far higher. Cities that had surrendered to Alexander were sacked again by his successors. Tyre was rebuilt and then destroyed a second time. Thebes, which Alexander had razed, was rebuilt by Cassander, but only as a monument to his own power. The people of Greece were moved like pieces on a board. Populations were forcibly relocated to new cities. The old city-states lost their independence. The phalanx that had conquered the world was now a tool of civil war. The aftermath of Ipsus solidified three major kingdoms. Ptolemaic Egypt, with its capital at Alexandria, became the wealthiest and most stable. Seleucid Asia stretched from the Mediterranean to the Indus, but it was too large and too diverse to control effectively. Antigonid Macedonia held Greece and the Aegean, but it was constantly at war with its neighbors. Each kingdom claimed to be the true heir of Alexander. Each minted coins with his image. Each employed Greek administrators and generals, but none could reunite the empire. The roads that Alexander had built now carried tax collectors, not soldiers. The cities he had founded became rivals, not allies. In 200 BC, the Roman Republic entered the eastern Mediterranean. The pretext was a dispute over the Greek cities of Athens and Rhodes. The real reason was that Rome had become the dominant power in the West and could no longer tolerate a strong Hellenistic king. The Roman legions defeated Philip V of Macedon at Cynocephaly in 197 BC. His son Perseus was defeated at Pydna in 168 BC. The Antigonid kingdom was dismantled. The Seleucid kingdom collapsed under internal rebellion and Parthian pressure. In 64 BC, the Roman general Pompey annexed the remnants. Egypt fell in 30 BC after Cleopatra's suicide. What remained after the empire was not a political structure, but a cultural one. The Greek language became the common tongue of the Eastern Mediterranean. The Library of Alexandria preserved hundreds of thousands of scrolls. The museum conducted research in astronomy, geography, medicine. Euclid wrote the elements. Archimedes invented the screw and the lever. Eratosthenes calculated the circumference of the earth. But this culture was built on the spoils of endless war. The technology of siegecraft advanced more rapidly than agriculture. The literature of the period is filled with themes of exile, loss, and regret. The lesson of the impossible conquest is that human ambition, however brilliant, cannot transcend human mortality. Alexander's dream of a unified world ended with his fever. The generals who tried to claim his mantle ended up destroying what he built. The cities he founded became capitals of rival.